Welcome. We're glad to have you participate in this conversation. I'm pleased to be able to talk with Dr. Dan Hawk. Dan is professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Ashland Theological Seminary. And today we're going to be conversing on the topic of remembering who we are, monuments, memorials, and identity. And I'd asked Dan to participate in this conversation because Dan's research is really timely for this discussion that we're having in this national conversation. So I thought that he could help us understand, particularly as Christians, how we can think about this and how we can carry this conversation forward. So Dan, welcome. I'm glad that you're able to talk with us.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for the invitation. And as you said, it's an important and timely conversation to have.
Yeah, it sure is. And it's a conversation that right now is certainly fraught with a lot of emotion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And It's one of those conversations that, as sometimes we say, often generates more heat than light. And so I was kind of hoping that we could just have a conversation that was enlightening and maybe help us think through this a little bit better together. So I'd like to begin by asking you to tell the audience a little bit about your background in scholarship and the work that you have done as an Old Testament scholar that will help us think through this, because as I've read some of your research on this, again, and I've been reading it for several years, this topic is very timely to the work that you've done. So if you could talk to us a little bit about that, I would appreciate that.
Okay, great. Love to. I find the entire Old Testament fascinating, but I'm particularly drawn to the narrative literature, so what we commonly refer to as the historical books. But I'm mostly interested in those narratives because I'm interested in the way that stories work, how we tell stories, what goes into telling stories, how different cultures tell different stories in different ways. So this is a subdiscipline of biblical studies that is called narrative criticism, and that's where I feel most at home, just looking at biblical narratives. Looking first of all at the wonderful artistry, the ways that biblical narratives are put together. Everybody, biblical writers aren't just telling stories. They're not just remembering the past. They have something to say. They have a theological point to make in every story that they tell in the Old Testament, and in fact in the New Testament as well with the Gospels. So they're wanting to make theological points. They're wanting to make points. They're wanting to send messages about truth and about God and about human identity and human relationship with God. And so they do that in particular ways. So I'm really interested in particular, and have been interested for some time, in those ways that they tell the story as a way of understanding the point that they want to make. So broadly speaking, so there's that particular element. So looking at the narrative literature of ancient Israel, which is very different. They had a very different way of thinking about what makes a good story in ancient Israel than we do in modern America. We're heirs of the Greeks, for example, so we like long stories with lots of detail, fill in all the gaps and help me to understand how things work together. But ancient Israel had a different idea of what makes a good story and how to tell those stories differently. So they, for example, they were interested in economy of language, so packing a lot of information into a minimum amount of language, leaving lots of gaps, that holes in the stories, loose ends that draw readers in, and whereas we read stories to get a sense of information, ancient Israel was really writing their stories in a way that would draw us into an encounter with the living God, that would cause us to reflect, faithful readers to reflect and think about, put themselves into those contexts. So So that's a larger piece of what I do, and one of the important pieces for our topic today is just the observation that we tell stories, generally speaking, because in some way our telling of the stories and our listening to the stories in the way that they have been told reinforces beliefs, reinforces a sense of identity, reinforces our ideas of what is true. So telling the story for ancient Israel was really the first place that you start. It's the very bedrock. So you'll notice when you read the Old Testament, you don't start off with laws, you don't start off with principles, you don't start off with advice. You start by one grand story that takes you from Genesis all the way through Second Kings. And then it's like you rewind and you go back and you tell the same story again, this time through Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. So it's and those stories, those narratives, those two large narratives are very different in the kinds of messages that they send, and they're written to advance different ideas of what it means to be in relationship to God, not necessarily contradictory, but complementary visions of what it means to be in relationship to God, who Israel is as a people, and how they are to live. So Israel, so the Old Testament starts with story, and the idea is everything else that comes after that in the biblical canon is to be interpreted in light of how we see God operating and who we see God is as portrayed in the story. The same thing. So narrative is primary. Israel's faith is predicated on remembering what God has done, and out of that remembering, then drawing some implications and getting a sense of because of what God has done and because of who God is, this is who we are. So remembering and then confession. You have the very same thing in the New Testament. Where does the New Testament start? It starts by telling 4 different stories. Same basic story, but told in 4 different ways through the Gospels. So the final point I want to even zero in further on is I've been particularly interested in the book of Joshua, which I have argued in many ways, not only using narrative criticism, but drawing some insight from social science studies, is Joshua is a book that on a certain level is about how Israel came to possess the land of Israel. Israel, the people, came to possess the land that they called Israel. But at a deeper level, it's working on something much more profound. And that is, it's working through, by virtue of remembering the past, Israel is thinking through what it means to be the people of God. So again, in a sense, every remembering of the past for any people is an exercise in identity formation. We tell our national stories. We tell them in a particular way in order to advance, reinforce, undergird this idea of who we are. And anyway, so and the way we remember the past is always in flux. I mean, there are certain elements that are constant, but the way that we think about them, the way sometimes as we look back through history, we realize that certain events that we thought were really important were not as important as we did. Some things that we thought were unimportant turned out to be really significant. Sometimes we realize we need to tell those stories a little bit differently because they reflect differently on who we are now as opposed to who we are then. So so my scholarship on Joshua has been really located toward kind of understanding how Israel is doing that, and then to make a connection with the United States, who, like Israel, grounds our identity as a people in this land through a narrative of conquest.
Yeah. One of the points you've said this several times, that history, that this story that we have, regardless of if it's Israel or say the United States, is really a story that shapes our identity, right? Our understanding of who we are, which explains why the current controversy is generating so much emotion on all sides, right?
Right.
Yeah, because
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I think that's right. I mean, you hear a lot of people right now talking about erasing history or revising history. As I said, history is always in flux. History is always being, in a sense, rethought and revised. And sometimes because the issue of identity and its connection to that story is so deeply embedded, it creates a lot of emotion when you begin to have conversations about how we're telling the story.
Yeah. I mean, I learned growing up in school and going through American history and living in Ohio history, and you go through all of this, and the stories, the way the history was told, was pretty antiseptic compared to what we've learned since then. So what you mentioned, this notion that history is always in flux, which I think is one of the issues, right? That some people think that this history is written in stone. This is the version, and this flux that we're experiencing now, they see as erasing history. What accounts right now? Because this is a huge state of flux, it seems to me. Well, what accounts for that for us in the United States?
The sense of unsettledness.
Yeah. I mean, it's particularly pronounced right now in terms of our history.
Yeah, I think what's one of the things that's really happening is that those who wrote or those who determined how the nation's story is going to be told was pretty much white America. I mean, and it's so white people, in a sense, have been from the beginning the ones we tell the story in a way that reflects our values, that reflects our experience, that reflects our perspectives, and our sense of who we are as a people. And the idea is, we recognize that there are other people groups here, but they're kind of subsumed within the white story. And so kind of our version of the story, which has become the conventional version of the story for more than 200 years, it's in a sense the sacred story version of the story, has pretty much been a story that has communicated, maybe intentionally or not, that this is a story about white America, and in this story, it's white Americans who mainly count. And we have now been under the push of some really significant demographic shifts over the last 2 or 3 decades, and rapidly approaching a point in which we as a nation are no longer going to be a nation within, it depends on who you read, 10, 20 years. We're no longer going to be a nation where one people group has a majority. So we are different, we are, in a sense, we're a different country than we were when this story started. And there are lots of other stories now, experiences that are bubbling up from different people groups whose stories have pretty much been suppressed because, they weren't really important in the way that white America told the story. And so it's narratives work really fundamentally. They work at a level below the intellect. So it's why sometimes you can hear a story or read something and it'll provoke an emotional reaction. So we've got a tension right now, and as we're talking about our past, as we're confronting, in a sense, some aspects of the past that white America didn't really want to include in the story, we are fundamentally engaged in a necessary conversation about who we are. We're negotiating the story, even as we're trying to figure out how we all fit together.
So then part of this discussion that we're having really is a question of how we want to and how we need to understand ourselves, right? It's not just about past actors. It's about who we see, what's our identity.
Yeah, who matters and what matters, and who determines that?
Yeah, and who is space made for, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, and obviously this discussion, this historical discussion where we now have these narratives that are now being told that have been suppressed. These tell the stories that we've been raised with in a way that is different and often disturbing.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to face this, right? I mean, Columbus is a good example.
Sure.
You know, I grew up being the great-grandson of Italian immigrants. Columbus always figured very prominently for American Italians, you know, because he was Italian, and it was something that he is someone that Italian communities have celebrated. And we've now learned all of these things about the history of Columbus and the Spanish that he led here that isn't that quite frankly is horrific.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I think you're right. So we're reassessing again the white settler story of America begins with Columbus, who discovers, which means basically he found this place where we all now live, and he started this whole era in which the Western Hemisphere was colonized and conquered by European powers. He himself was pretty bloodthirsty and was not shy about committing today what we would call war crimes. So there's a whole aspect of Columbus as both his character. He famously said, for example, after his first trip to the New World, he came back and told the Spanish monarchs that the people he met were friendly, generous, hospitable, and didn't know warfare. And he could take the whole island with just 50 armed soldiers. So when he came back the second voyage, he came back with 1,500 Spanish soldiers and 17 boats. And he began a conquest, really, that wiped out within 150 years the entire population of the Caribbean. And so, you know, for white America, he's the beginning point, and we kind of set him up literally on a pedestal. We want to honor him for that. But for other people groups, he represents, particularly for indigenous peoples, he represents something much more sinister. And that's the kind of differing kinds of stories that we've got to now begin to find a way to listen to and talk about as we now also work through some of the legacies of our own colonial practices.
yeah, and you certainly can't say we're just going to ignore this part of the history at this point. And this has led, I think, you know, one of the focal points of this whole discussion right now has to do with monuments and memorials and everything from Columbus and, of course, you know, the Confederate memorials, which has been, it seems to me, a focal point of the debate. But even moving beyond that, right? Some people suggesting that memorials of our presidents like Jefferson come down, that kind of thing. Which for many people, that's just a bridge too far, right? It's one thing to talk about the Confederate generals coming down because they rebelled against the country and they wanted to perpetuate a system of slavery. But somebody like Jefferson, who certainly owned slaves and his relationship with Sally Hemings, which certainly didn't start out as a consensual relationship. I think we can say that safely. Also was someone who, gave birth to the founding documents and, was governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia that had, laws that promoted freedom. So he's a complex character. And so this is all into this mix of discussion we're having right now, an argument. And the question is, where do we go with this?
Yeah, and I think the monuments really raise this idea that what does Jefferson mean to different people groups? What does he represent? And that's in a sense what's been percolating up to the surface. I mean, as the stories come up, and again, as we've been, we're having to come to grips as a society now with all kinds of legacies of violence in various ways, particularly against people of color. These monuments do two things. First and foremost, they're touch points. They're visual reminders of the story that we tell about our nation. And again, as I said before, that story has been pretty much a story told by white America. And so by far, with very few exceptions, most of the memorials and statues around our nation look like white people. They represent points in that story that white America, or even localized groups of Americans, want to say, that's the story. So they're touch points, and they reinforce for a society who matters and what's worth remembering. And so when you talk about who we set up on a pedestal, you're really talking about who we are, and that's an important piece. The second piece is that memorials, in a sense, memorials mark a claim to the land. They cement the relationship between a people and the territory that it inhabits. It's a way of saying, of a people saying, this land belongs to us. We belong in this land. And this is why we and the land are one. And so we do that. Monuments have a role in doing this because they, in a sense, they remake the landscape. So we do certain things. We put up monuments that change, in a sense, the visual impact of the terrain in which we live, so that we see a reflection of ourselves in it, and that consolidates. Anthony D. Smith, who's written a lot about this, talks about creating ethnoscapes. We transform landscapes into ethnoscapes. Visual markers that continue to say, we are the people who belong here, and this is our story. And again, when you look at the monuments, what they're saying is this land belongs to people who look like us, and the us that it looks like is, for the most part, white America.
Yeah, I've often thought about the statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, which has become over the last few years such a touch point for controversy, is that such a prominent and, quite frankly, imposing statue. Mm-hmm. And what that would say to, during the Jim Crow era, where we were, supposedly separate but equal, what would that say to Black Americans walking by that statue of Robert E. Lee? Yeah,
and we could even go broader with this. I mean, I think there was a remarkable demonstration of the way that monuments and a certain version of history are woven together. There was a remarkable demonstration of that when President Trump on Independence Day weekend went to Mount Rushmore, which is the most massive, grand monument that we have. It is a literal remaking of the landscape so that it looks like four prominent white leaders. So again, these narratives really go deep, and a lot of times that's why memorials often say more than we realize.
Mm.
There's a sense in which they participate to reinforce something that a lot of us know underneath on one side or another, but sometimes isn't explicit. So one of the questions that comes out would be, why, for example, did this nation choose to create its most massive monument in the Black Hills? And why these particular presidents? There's an official view of the story. Well, Mount Rushmore was chosen because it reflected the grandeur, the landscape reflected the grandeur of America. And the sculptor himself said that Washington represented the birth of the nation, and Jefferson represented its expansion. Lincoln represented it's the indissolubility of the Union, and Roosevelt kind of represented the entrepreneurial spirit. So that's the official view. But then you reflect on the fact that the Black Hills were sacred to the Lakota people, and that the United States took possession of the Black Hills by military force and overrode Article 6 of the Constitution to do it, which has to do with honoring treaties, and just forcibly seized it. And so it's interesting. So in this sacred place, a place that is sacred, it's like in a sense a temple in a European society. So in this sacred place, we choose to put our biggest monuments as white America. And so in a sense, one of the things when you look at those four presidents from a different perspective, you say, well, okay, Washington set the main trajectories of American Indian policy, and himself was responsible for some pretty bad stuff with Native people. Jefferson was the first president to openly suggest that Native peoples who lived east of the Mississippi should just all be removed west of the Mississippi. President Lincoln, the day after signing the Emancipation Proclamation, authorized the largest mass hanging in U.S. history when 37 Dakota freedom fighters in Minnesota were hanged. And Roosevelt was someone who drove very hard the forcible assimilation of Native people. To make them white, kill the Indian, save the child was the motto. Boarding schools and criminalizing languages and customs. So there are multiple stories attached to those, that monument and what it represents. So having said that, the next question, at least for me, was why would President Trump, in a time of significant racial crisis and ferment, a time when things just feel like they're getting out of hand, why would he choose to go to Mount Rushmore to have a patriotic badge? And why would he talk in a speech? I mean, when you listen to the speech he gave there, it's about winning. It's about defeating bad, evil people. It's about conquering. So he's using all of this language within, against the backdrop of this monument on indigenous, in an indigenous sacred space. And then, I was flabbergasted when it came to this part in the speech. He invokes specifically manifest destiny. We are the people of a manifest destiny. And that was a phrase that occurred during the 19th century, fell out of use after the 19th century, but basically it was the way that white America justified the conquest of the West, the whole all of the things that we did to put this nation together, and not to mention some of what we did to other people groups. But behind it was a belief in the 19th century that the Anglo-Saxon race was the most advanced race on the earth and had a destiny to plant a civilization that was the highest expression of humanity.
Yeah.
So, all of that to say, why would an American president, against the backdrop of something that says, we won, this land belongs to we white people, in the sanctuary, in a sense, of an indigenous people group, why would he invoke manifest destiny? And again, was he saying more than he realized, in a sense, in terms of, here's the story, and here's who matters in the story, and by golly, we're going to defend that. And here's one of the old images that really undergirded white supremacy and justified all manner of conquest and atrocity as we moved westward.
Yeah. I'm listening to you talk about that, and one of the things that strikes me is the language of basically the language of warfare, of winning. I often say that we can approach life in one of two ways, either with an open hand or a closed fist. And it seems that right now there's a lot of people with closed fists, and this is going to be done our way. We're going to
going to defend this version of the story.
That's right. I'm going to defend this because this is the right version.
Mm-hmm. And it's all about domination.
It's all about domination. And, we're going to speak the loudest and be the loudest, and our version's going to win. And it strikes me that is not the kind of language that the Christian faith should be using. And so I think that kind of leads me to where I really want to go with this. I mean, there's a lot of complexity in this, right? There's a lot of complexity and nuance in this that, we're going to have a long conversation about how this plays out. One of the things I think about when I think about a notion of cooperation instead of competition in this is it's not just a matter of what monuments should stay and go, but what monuments should be added. How do we include representations of people who have not been included in this story that should be, right?
Yeah,
right. So it may not be a matter of tearing down Thomas Jefferson, which, me personally, I don't want to do. But it's a matter of putting up monuments for other people who have not been recognized simply because they weren't part of the white story.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really important because one could see in a lot of the ferment that's been bubbling up, particularly with reference to the monument, is, again, from people who have not had a voice in the story because they haven't participated fully in this society that we've set up. So we have, in a sense, a certain segment of the society, white America, I'm speaking very generally, that have said, we've been able to dictate the terms of how we live together now for 200 years or so, and we kind of feel our ability to do that slipping away.
Yeah.
So we're going to reassert ourselves because that's kind of what we've always done. So I can see why people, particular the segment of the white population would resonate very clearly with what Mr. Trump was saying at Mount Rushmore. But these are really, as you noted, these are really deep sentiments. And as a Christian, actually, I've been thinking through kind of this impulse to dominate in light of the Apostle Paul's statement about Jesus in Philippians chapter 2, that he had a privileged position with God. He had equality with God. He had a high place. He was in that place of deity where he could have exerted rightfully dominance in a certain sense, but he poured himself out and became in the form of a servant. So for me, the challenge as a Christian is the insight into this moment in the way that Christians in America, particularly white Christians, are dealing with the present moment is the impulse to dominate and maintain control and privilege up against we as followers of Jesus being called to be imitators of God, of Jesus, who poured himself out. And that's a really stark kind of division of positions, Christian positions. And obviously it's obvious where I would kind of end up there.
Sure.
What does it mean to be what does it mean to pour oneself out like Jesus did for the sake of others?
Yeah, for the sake of others, for me, is an important phrase, because certainly we see this in Jesus, and we see that where I think there's a lot of white Americans who look at all of this change and they feel like the ground is shifting beneath their feet.
Yeah.
They grew up in school, they were taught the story of Columbus a certain way, they celebrated, there were Columbus Day parades, they made crafts out of construction paper of the Santa Maria, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so now they're hearing this other side, and they're listening to these other people, and they feel like the ground is shifting beneath their feet.
Yeah.
And it does become very difficult. But yet, I think for Christians, that's where we have to go, right? I mean, so I guess that kind of leads me to maybe the last question in this conversation that we can take a few minutes on is, how do Christians respond? What are the practical things we can do? And maybe this is where to start is, how do we see this through a scriptural lens, right? How do we see all of this through what the scripture teaches us as our foundational narrative as Christians?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I think, first of all, in terms of reading scripture, it's important to acknowledge that we have some pretty large blind spots in the way that we see and interpret scripture. We have our own favorite parts of the Bible, which, like the monuments, reflect ourselves back to us and kind of confirm our own beliefs. But there's a lot of scripture that we overlook and we suppress, like we suppress other voices, so that we can maintain the view of scripture that really corresponds with our sense of Christian identity, our sense of what God's values are. So I think first of all, it's important to realize that we do have blind spots, and one of those blind spots has to do with the way that the Bible deals with race, ethnicity, and justice, which are fundamental. The Bible is fundamentally concerned with constructions of ethnicity and with the doing of justice. And we tend not to see that in many parts of the church in the United States. Justice is a fundamental virtue that flows out of the covenant. It's biblical justice is the idea that everyone in society has the right to has access to those things that allow life to flourish. And the problem is we live in a deeply broken world in which we don't live in that way. We live with great disparities of wealth and power and position. And so the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, is fundamentally concerned with, and the phrase is doing justice. So, in a sense, recognizing the brokenness within the sinful human system and working to bring things into a little more of an alignment with each other so people can flourish. So that's that idea. It's in the Sinai covenant code, and it's particularly in the prophets. Interesting, by the way, if you're a student of the prophets, next time you work your way through that literature, compare how many times the prophets condemn excesses of wealth and power with the amount of times that they condemn what is our kind of, for many people, the basic ethical issues of the day, which have to do with all kinds of sexual matters. You'll pretty quickly see where the prophets' priorities were and what they emphasized as a first order. And then secondly, so that's justice. And secondly, and this is one of the beautiful things, I think, just mind-blowing, sophisticated, beautiful things about biblical narratives. Israel's narrative, the way they told stories was through subtlety. And some of the Bible's most powerful points are communicated in subtle ways, so that you really have to kind of dig in and think through to really see what the Bible is saying. So, for example, the biblical story, Israel's story itself, begins with the calling of Abraham, and God telling Abraham to move out of his land and his people, to go to a place he doesn't know where he's going. God says, I'll tell you when you get there, in so many words. And God's saying, I'm going to bless you. You're going to have a lot of descendants, and I'm going to bless the world through you. So as we work through the story in Genesis, we see how God is developing that relationship with Abraham, so that Abraham will be that agent of blessing to the world. Now, having said that, the Bible also, at a key point toward the end of Abraham's story, also tells the story of a slave woman named Hagar. And we look at that story and we just read it and say, well, interesting story. And yeah, okay. And I've heard all of the sermons. Yes, Hagar, her purpose was that when Abraham decided that he could figure out how God was going to give him a descendant, because he was old, he couldn't have any, and Sarah was old, she was past the time of childbearing. So they gave Hagar, he told Hagar, went into Hagar and at Sarah's behest, and tried to figure out what God was doing and take it into their own hands. And the result was Ishmael. So I don't know how many sermons I've heard about, watch out that you don't create an Ishmael. When God gives you a promise, let God fulfill it. Don't take it into your own hands.
Yeah.
Okay. But if you look more deeply at that story and you pay attention to what the biblical writer is doing, it's remarkably detailed and sophisticated. Hagar is introduced in terms that highlight her ethnicity, her social position, and her gender. Three basic ways that human beings divide themselves into hierarchies of power in a broken world. So here's Abram, who is the high position, center of the story, Israelite, Semitic male. And then we're told, and Sarah had an Egyptian slave woman. Her name was Hagar. And as you work through the story, you pick up that neither Abram nor Sarai call her by name. It's just my servant girl, your slave girl. The narrator and God in the story call her by name. And when you get her story is told in two parts. When you get to the end of the first part, where Hagar has been forced, or she's left her family to go into an unknown territory. So it sounds a little bit about like Abram's kind of first steps toward God. And she takes off, leaves her family, goes into the wilderness. God finds her and he blesses her. And he tells her she's going to have lots of descendants. So that's just a teaser to illustrate that there's a lot going on in that particular story, but the biblical writer is telling that story to highlight someone who is at the complete opposite end of the human spectrum socially than Abram is.
Yeah.
And she is valued in her own right. She has a story, her own story, and it's wrapped around in some very interesting ways. It's wrapped around Abram's stories as if the writer is saying to the Israelites who are at the center of the story, don't get the idea that because you're at the center of everything and that because I'm blessing you, that I don't care about and bless lots of other people.
Yes.
You need, so the God and the biblical writer elevate, in a sense, they elevate Hagar by virtue of the way they tell the story up to a level that Abram is.
Yeah.
Even though Abram's the central story, I mean, that you've got this little digression that goes off that just says, and remember, wealth and power and privilege and all of these things, are the way human society is configured. It's broken. God doesn't see the value of those hierarchies. God values the voices and desires the flourishing of all human beings. So the biblical narratives themselves, and that's just one example out of many, have all of these stories that in the way that they are told all the way through the narrative, keep pressing at this idea that the divisions of race, gender, social class, that the human world values and empowers are not the way that God looks at people. And that God, if we're going to see as God sees, then we also need to be about the business of seeing to the flourishing of all people, even if that means a diminishment in perspective and privilege. And as a footnote, I mean, if you when you read the Gospels, you see Jesus going out of his way to tell stories of the same kind about Samaritans. You see him going into Gentile countries and telling a Syro-Phoenician woman, that he's never seen faith like this in all Israel. Same with a Roman centurion, that Jesus is astonished at their faith. The gospel writers are telling us something about Jesus and about God by telling us those particular stories with those particular punchlines.
Yeah.
So I think a large part of what we need to do as people of Scripture is really to learn to read Scripture with attention to the way that the Bible really does, really is really concerned with redressing and speaking to the broken features of human society, because that's what God is doing. God desires for all human beings to flourish. So we need to be shaped by that vision rather than the other narratives that claim our allegiance.
Yeah, and it's hard for us to read Scripture in that way. And in fact, it's hard for us, I think, to even tell history in that way. We're always attracted to the historical figures that represent power, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. We tell the story of the Civil War, for example, through the lens of what the generals did on the battlefields. Yeah. We don't often tell those stories thinking about what the slaves went through and about I've often said that, with the Confederate flag that flew over on South Carolina state capitol, which became an issue several years ago with the murder of the worshipers in Charleston by Dylan Roof. I said, I wonder what, in 1865, I wonder if the mother in Ohio who lost her 3 sons in battle would be in favor of the battle flag of the opposing army being unfurled at the state capitol. And I think for Christians, sometimes, you're talking about the subtlety and the nuance in those stories. And we do miss it, right? Because we tend not to see those persons of no account, but from God's perspective, those people do count, right? And so we quote the Philippians 2, the hymn that Paul quotes us for there about Jesus divesting himself of power. But yet the way we look at the world on a daily basis,
that's a good point. Yeah.
We don't do that. We say it, we use it in worship. And I think, honestly, we want to live up to that ideal, but on a daily basis, it's very difficult for us to do that.
Well, it's important. I'm glad you went down that line. It just illustrates again how important it is that we recognize our blind spots, which bring us into collusion with unjust, oppressive, and broken systems of power. The very systems of power that Jesus himself refused to be entangled with, even though they tried. So that's why I think in this moment it's so important for particularly white Christians simply just to learn to educate ourselves, more importantly to listen, to develop relationships with people of color, to learn other stories, and in a sense to resist that impulse that I myself feel to say, no, that's, let me correct that story. Let me give you the other side. Well, it's really an important time if we're going to come to, I believe, if we're going to come together as a nation, that segment of us who have, in a sense, enjoyed privilege and power, and in which certain parts are really contesting now. It's really important for us to take the steps intentionally into conversations that can have the capacity to bring us together. I think the church, we should be leading the way in this. We are those to whom the ministry of reconciliation has been entrusted. We are those who are blessed to be peacemakers. So we've got to find a way to model the humility and love and empathy and compassion of Jesus, and just find a way to be the lead in having those kinds of conversations that are very difficult, and in which other voices that haven't had the prominence or the participation in the story, we listen to them, and that's a long, difficult process that I won't see the end of, I'm sure. But I think it's really important that we do it. I mean, and it's a tragedy in my opinion that so much of the church is instead choosing to respond to the suffering that's bubbling up with belligerence.
Yeah, and that really goes to the heart of, I think, a lot of what we're talking about, whether we're going to see this through the lens of that place of power and privilege, or are we going to see this through the, what I would call a prophetic lens, where the prophetic witness of the Bible is to be the voice that speaks up for those who have no voice.
Yeah. And
those voices that are speaking now, we need to be able to be the ones who step in and say, we support and we give a hearing. We need to give a hearing here, because it's about peacemaking and reconciliation, but you can't have either one of those without truthfulness.
Yeah.
And so we have to be that voice.
Yeah, and it's not just the hearing. I mean, we it's the doing.
I know.
So we're hearing and we're doing. It strikes me. I love the prophets. I've been teaching them for 34 years, and you can kind of, what the prophets were just trying to do was to remind Israel of the vision of humanity and of redemption that God had given them, and just to set that vision and articulate that vision again to a people who had just been entangled and defined by the alternative visions and narratives of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Prophets are just reminding Christian people, I think. I mean, prophetic voices, I should say, in that sense, are simply there to remind us, as the Old Testament prophets reminded the people of Israel, of what is central to God's vision for humanity, to our mission in the world, and therefore to our Christian identity.
Yeah. Dan, this has been a great conversation, and I greatly appreciate your study in this area, your research, your wisdom. I appreciate the voice that you are in this area, and it is certainly my hope and my prayer that we as the church can become a voice and an example of what God's vision is for this world. It is a long conversation. It's going to take a lot of time. Before we conclude, any last words for us?
Simply just again an encouragement to begin to read the Bible with an open spirit, an open mind, and to understand that the Bible speaks to the particulars of our human experience, all of those particulars.
Yeah.
So that issues of ethnicity and race and power and justice are not just social issues. They're biblical issues. And if they're biblical issues and we're people of the book, then those, that vision which the Bible gives us should become part of who we are and how we live in the world.
Yeah. Well, those are good words for us to conclude our conversation. Thank you very much, Dan, for taking the time to sit with me and to talk to us. And I know you're continuing to do work in this area, so I look forward to seeing it.
All right. Thank you, Matt, for the invitation. Thank you for the conversation.
All right. Yep. See you soon, Dan.